Jesus of Nazareth is often remembered through miracles, parables, and moments of divine power. We picture the healings, the sermons, the crowds gathered on hillsides, and the dramatic events that changed history. But rarely do we pause to ask a quieter, more human question. What did his ordinary nights look like? After the crowds went home, after the teachings ended, after the dust of the road settled, where did Jesus sleep? Strip away for a moment the stained glass and the grand paintings. Step out of the cathedral and onto a first-century dirt road in Galilee. The sun has gone down. The air is cooling quickly. The wind moves through olive trees and tall grasses. A traveling teacher and his small group of followers have walked many kilometers since dawn. Their feet are sore. Their clothes carry the dust of the road. There are no hotels, no streetlights, no modern comforts waiting at day's end. Imagine Jesus not only as a spiritual figure, but as a traveling man, physically tired, exposed to weather, dependent on hospitality, navigating uncertain terrain. A man who experienced hunger, thirst, and fatigue. A man whose mission unfolded not from a throne or a palace, but from footpaths between villages. Tonight, we explore a question that is simple on the surface, yet deeply revealing. How and where did Jesus sleep during his journeys through Galilee? This is not an attempt to reduce the sacred to the ordinary, but to better understand the ordinary that carried the sacred. Instead of approaching the story only through theology, we will also look through a historical and anthropological lens, examining geography, travel customs, social traditions, and daily survival in the ancient Near East. What options did a traveling teacher realistically have at night? What were the risks? What were the routines? What did rest even mean in a world without electricity, inns on every road, or guaranteed shelter? By grounding the story in lived reality, a new dimension appears, one that makes the journey more vivid, more tactile, more human. The dust, the cold ground, the shared fires, the borrowed rooms, the open sky. To understand how Jesus taught, we can also ask how he rested. To understand his strength, we can look at his fatigue. And to understand his mission, we can begin with his nights. To understand how Jesus slept during his journeys, we must first understand where he walked. First-century Galilee was not an abstract biblical backdrop. It was a real landscape of hills, water, farms, villages, and long winding paths. Geography shaped daily life, and daily life shaped how and where a traveler could rest at night. Galilee lay in the northern part of ancient Israel, a region known for its natural contrasts. Rolling hills rose and fell across the countryside, broken by fertile valleys where wheat and barley grew. Olive groves dotted the slopes. Fig trees and vineyards appeared near settlements. Fishing villages clustered around the freshwater lake known today as the Sea of Galilee, also called Lake Gennesaret or Tiberias. This lake was not only a food source, but a transportation corridor and social hub. Many of Jesus' earliest followers came from these shoreline communities. Most settlements were small, clusters of stone homes, storage caves, animal pens, and shared ovens. Nazareth, Jesus' childhood home, was likely a modest hillside village with a population counted in the hundreds, not thousands. Capernaum, Bethsaida, and similar towns were working communities of fishermen, farmers, and craftsmen. Between them stretched open land, sometimes cultivated, sometimes wild. The climate added another layer of difficulty to travel. Galilee experiences a Mediterranean pattern, long, dry summers and cooler, wetter winters. During the hot months, daytime temperatures could become intense, especially under direct sun on exposed hillsides. There was little shade outside groves and villages. Heat drained energy quickly and forced travelers to ration water carefully.
But the nights told a different story. After sunset, temperatures could drop sharply. Without modern insulation or layered gear, travelers felt the cold directly. Wind moving down from higher elevations made open areas even harsher. A person who sweated through the day's walk could become chilled soon after dark. This swing between hot days and cold nights made sleep outdoors physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. Roads in Galilee varied greatly in quality. The Roman Empire was famous for its engineering, and major imperial roads connected key cities and military routes. These were paved, graded, and maintained, but they did not reach every village. Most local travel happened on dirt paths and foot trails shaped by generations of use. These routes followed natural contours, around hills, across shallow valleys, and beside water sources. They were often rocky, uneven, and narrow. Travel was almost entirely done on foot. Pack animals such as donkeys were used when available, but many travelers walked, carrying their own provisions. A typical walking pace in that era covered roughly 20 to 30 kilometers per day under decent conditions. Terrain, weather, health, and group size could reduce that distance significantly. This meant that many journeys could not neatly be completed within a single day. A traveler heading from Nazareth to Capernaum, roughly 35 kilometers, would likely need at least a day and a half, often two. Unless perfectly timed with available lodging, night would fall before arrival. The road itself would decide where sleep happened. Travel, therefore, created built-in uncertainty around rest. One could not assume reaching a safe bed by nightfall. Delays from teaching crowds, illness, weather shifts, or blocked routes could force unplanned stops. Water sources and defensible terrain influenced where travelers chose to settle for the night. Companions mattered, local knowledge mattered, timing mattered. In this environment, sleep was not scheduled, it was negotiated with the land. Every night's rest depended on distance covered, welcome received, and conditions endured. Understanding these realities brings us closer to seeing Jesus not only as a teacher moving between stories, but as a traveler moving between nights.
When we read the gospel accounts closely, a clear pattern emerges. Jesus was almost always on the move. His ministry was not centered in a palace, a school, or a single temple location. It unfolded along roads, across lakes, between villages, and an open countryside. To understand how he slept, we must first understand how constantly he traveled. Jesus began in Nazareth, the small hillside village where he grew up. But once his public ministry started, Nazareth quickly became more of a point of origin than a permanent base. Much of his activity shifted toward the region around the Sea of Galilee, especially towns such as Capernaum and Bethsaida. These fishing communities became frequent stopping places, teaching locations, and gathering points for followers. Yet even there, he did not establish a fixed residence of his own. The Gospels repeatedly describe movement, going from town to town, village to village, synagogue to synagogue. One day he's teaching by the lakeshore, another day he's on a hillside, another inside a village home, then on the road again. His mission was mobile by design, meant to reach people where they lived and worked, rather than waiting for them to come to him. This itinerant lifestyle meant instability in the most practical sense. There was no guaranteed bed, no personal house prepared at day's end, no predictable routine of return. At times, he stayed in the homes of followers or supporters. At other times, he withdrew to isolated places. There are even recorded sayings that acknowledge this reality directly, that unlike animals with dens or birds with nests, the Son of Man had no fixed place to lay his head. Whether taken symbolically or practically, it reflects a lived condition of continual movement. Travel in that era was physically demanding.
Walking long distances over uneven terrain day after day placed constant strain on the body. Sandals offered limited protection. Roads were rough, heat drained strength. Hills required steady climbing. Add to this the weight of teaching, healing, debating, and engaging crowds, often for hours, and the level of fatigue becomes easier to imagine. Teaching itself was not a light task. Speaking outdoors without amplification required vocal strength. Addressing crowds required mental focus and emotional energy. Responding to challenges from critics demanded alertness. Offering comfort to the suffering required compassion that also draws from inner reserves. These were not isolated events, but repeated daily pressures layered on top of physical travel. Crowds also affected rest patterns. As his reputation grew, privacy decreased. People followed him between locations, sometimes arriving before he did. Requests for healing and help did not follow a schedule. Interruptions were frequent. Moments intended for quiet recovery could quickly turn into new teaching encounters. In such conditions, rest became not just necessary, but urgent, yet never fully secure. Logistics added further uncertainty. A day's journey might end near a friendly village or far from any settlement. Hospitality might be offered or refused. Weather might cooperate or turn harsh. Delays could push travel past sunset. Crossing the lake by boat could save time or introduce new dangers if storms arose. Each variable influenced where nightfall would find him. This constant motion shaped the rhythm of Jesus' life. It demanded adaptability, endurance, and a willingness to accept discomfort. Sleep was not simply a daily routine, it was a variable outcome at the end of unpredictable days. Some nights brought shelter and welcome, others brought exposure and vulnerability. To see Jesus as a constant traveler is to understand that his rest was never detached from his mission. The road was not only where he taught, it was where he grew tired, where he paused, and where he trusted that rest would be provided, somehow, somewhere, when night finally came. For a first-century traveler in Galilee, the most common place to sleep was not indoors, but outdoors. Open-air rest was not unusual, dramatic, or symbolic. It was practical reality. When distance, timing, or circumstance made village lodging unavailable, the night was spent beneath the sky. For Jesus and his disciples, this likely happened often. Travel days did not always end near a welcoming household. A teaching crowd might delay departure. A detour might extend the route. Fatigue might force an earlier stop than planned. When sunset approached and no settlement was within safe reach, the landscape itself became the bedroom. Sleeping outdoors required simple but deliberate preparation. The primary personal item used for warmth and bedding was the outer cloak or mantle. In ancient Jewish culture, this garment served multiple purposes: clothing by day, blanket by night. It was thick enough to provide insulation and durable enough to spread on the ground. Some travelers also carried an extra wrap or woven covering, but many relied solely on their cloak. The ground surface mattered. Experienced travelers looked for slightly elevated terrain, not hilltops exposed to wind, but gentle rises that reduced the risk of pooled moisture, insects, or sudden runoff from night condensation or unexpected rain. Dry soil or packed grass was preferred over bare rock when possible. Proximity to a tree, boulder, or slope could offer partial windbreak. Small fires were sometimes used when fuel was available. Dead branches, brush, and olive wood scraps could sustain a modest flame. Fire provided more than warmth. It offered psychological comfort and a measure of protection against animals. It also created a focal point for group rest, allowing companions to settle in a loose circle where conversation could continue briefly before sleep. Group safety shaped sleeping patterns. Rarely would a traveling band scatter widely at night. Proximity meant shared warmth, quicker response to danger and mutual awareness. In higher risk areas, someone might remain lightly alert or rotate watchfulness, especially if supplies or donations were being carried. Complete vulnerability was avoided when possible. Night in Galilee was not silent. Without urban noise, natural sounds dominated. Wind moving through dry grass, insects in a steady rhythm, distant animal calls, jackals, owls, nightbirds, movement in brush that might be harmless or not. For those unaccustomed to it, such soundscapes could feel unsettling. For seasoned travelers, they became familiar signals, part of reading the environment even while resting. Wild animal threats near populated areas were limited but not non-existent. Jackals and hyenas roamed certain regions. Snakes and scorpions were more common concerns near rocky ground. Choosing the right sleeping surface reduced risk. Sandals were kept close. Fires, when maintained, discouraged approach. Temperature drop remained one of the greatest challenges. Even after intensely hot days, desert edge and highland zones cooled rapidly after sunset. Body heat lost through contact with ground made insulation essential. Cloaks were wrapped tightly. Sleep posture, curled rather than stretched, helped conserve warmth. Shared body heat within a group also mattered. Without artificial lighting, sleep followed natural circadian rhythm more closely than in modern life. Darkness arrived quickly after sunset. Activity slowed. Conversation faded. Many people slept earlier and rose earlier than today's norms. Night waking was common, not insomnia, but segmented sleep shaped by biology and environment. A traveler might sleep, wake briefly, pray, watch the sky, then sleep again. For Jesus, nights outdoors may have also carried a spiritual dimension. The gospel narratives often mention him withdrawing to solitary places to pray, sometimes at night, sometimes before dawn. Open-air rest naturally created space for contemplation. With no roof overhead, the sky itself became the ceiling of reflection. Stars bright, air clear, horizons wide. Emotional solitude differs from physical solitude, but the two often meet at night. After hours surrounded by need, questions, conflict, and expectation, darkness offered quiet. No crowds, no debates, no demands, at least for a while. Fatigue and prayer likely mingled in those hours, weariness of body beside steadiness of purpose. Sleeping under the open sky was not romantic in the modern sense. It was uncomfortable, uncertain, and sometimes cold. Yet it was also honest, a direct encounter with creation, vulnerability, and dependence. No walls separated the sleeper from the world, only trust, preparation, and endurance. In such nights, rest was never luxurious, but it was real, and often it was enough to arise and walk again at first light.
While sleeping under the open sky was common for travelers in first-century Galilee, another equally important part of survival on the road was hospitality. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was not merely kindness. It was a moral duty, a social expectation, and a deeply rooted cultural value. For a traveling teacher like Jesus, this tradition often meant the difference between exposure and shelter, between hunger and a warm meal, between isolation and human welcome. Village life in Galilee operated through tight-knit community bonds. News traveled quickly. Strangers were noticed immediately. A visitor entering a settlement was rarely invisible. In such a culture, offering basic hospitality, water, bread, and a place to rest, was considered an act of honor. Sacred writings and long-standing customs reinforced the obligation to receive travelers, especially teachers and religious figures. Jesus and his disciples would have depended heavily on this network of welcome. The gospel narratives frequently mention him entering homes, those of fishermen, tax collectors, religious leaders, and ordinary families. Certain households appear to have received him repeatedly, suggesting ongoing relationships rather than one-time encounters.
These homes functioned as temporary bases, not owned but graciously shared. Homes in Galilee were modest by modern standards. Most were built of stone with packed earth floors and flat roofs made from wooden beams layered with branches and clay. Space was limited. Privacy was minimal. A typical house might consist of one main room where much of daily life occurred: cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. Some had an upper space or roof area used in warm weather. Sleeping arrangements inside these homes were simple and flexible. There were usually no permanent bedrooms with fixed beds. Instead, woven mats, blankets, or padded rolls were brought out at night and stored during the day. Guests often slept along the edges of the main room or in a side area if available. Families slept nearby. Shared space was normal. Personal comfort was secondary to shelter itself. Rooftops were another common sleeping place, especially in dry seasons. Flat roofs caught evening breezes and released the heat absorbed during the day. Accessed by an exterior stair or ladder, they provided a cooler and sometimes quieter resting area. A guest might be invited to sleep on the roof under a covering or canopy. From there, the night sky remained visible, a middle ground between indoors and open field. Arrival routines reflected both practicality and symbolism. One of the first acts of hospitality was the offering of water for foot washing. Roads were dusty, sandals left feet exposed. Washing removed discomfort and honored the guest. In some cases, a servant performed this task. In humbler homes, the host provided water and the guest washed personally. The act signaled transition from traveler to welcomed guest. Food followed availability, not abundance. A simple evening meal might include bread, olives, lentils, dried or salted fish, figs, or goat milk products. Meals were shared communally. Conversation often accompanied eating: stories from the road, news from other towns, questions about teaching. Oil lamps provided limited light. Activities wound down naturally after dark. Evening rhythms were slower than modern life. With little artificial lighting, households settled early. Doors were secured, animals were gathered close, mats were laid out, cloaks doubled as blankets. Sound carried easily through small spaces: breathing, movement, whispered prayer. Sleep came within the presence of others, not in isolation. Hospitality, however, was rarely a one-sided transaction. Cultural expectation held that a guest, especially a teacher, offered something in return. For Jesus, this was not payment, but presence. Teaching, blessing, prayer, counsel, these formed the reciprocal gift. A home offered shelter. He offered words of life, healing attention, or spiritual encouragement. The exchange reinforced relationship rather than commerce. This mutuality explains why many invitations likely came eagerly. Hosting a respected teacher elevated a household's honor and created opportunity for learning. It also allowed neighbors to gather. A private home could become an evening teaching space, a place where discussions extended late and questions found voice. Sleeping in the homes of others meant vulnerability and trust on both sides. The guest trusted the host for safety. The host trusted the guest with reputation and peace. For Jesus, whose life on the road depended on such openness, hospitality was not incidental, it was foundational. These borrowed rooms, shared floors, and open rooftops formed many of the nights of his ministry. Not owned spaces, but given ones. Not permanent, but sufficient. And within them, rest was received as a gift, not assumed as a right. Beyond open fields and private homes, there was another category of resting place available to travelers in first-century Galilee: public and semi-public structures, especially synagogues, covered porches, and community courtyards. These spaces were not designed as lodging facilities in the modern sense, yet they often functioned as practical shelters for those passing through, particularly teachers and religious visitors. The synagogue in that era was far more than a place of prayer alone. It served as the social, educational, and communal heart of many Jewish towns and villages. It was where scripture was read, discussions were held, disputes addressed, and community decisions communicated. Because of this central role, synagogue buildings were typically among the more solid and spacious structures in a settlement. Architecturally, synagogues often included a main gathering hall along with adjoining covered areas, porticos, entry spaces, or side chambers. These semi-enclosed sections provided shade during the day and protection from wind and dew at night. While not luxurious, they offered something invaluable to a traveler: a roof and defined walls. For a known teacher like Jesus, access to synagogue space would have been natural in many towns. The Gospel accounts frequently show him teaching in synagogues throughout Galilee. If he arrived late in the day or remained after extended discussion, it would not be unusual for local leaders or caretakers to permit him and his companions to remain within the sheltered perimeter overnight, especially in smaller communities where formal lodging options were limited. Covered porticos and colonnaded porches were also common features in public buildings and wealthier homes. These transitional spaces, open on one side, roofed above, created airflow while still providing cover. Travelers could rest there without fully entering private quarters. This made them socially convenient, sheltered but not intrusive. Courtyards functioned similarly. Many structures were built around an interior open-air courtyard surrounded by walls or rooms. At night, once gates were closed, such spaces offered a measure of security from roaming animals or opportunistic theft. Sleeping in a courtyard meant being outdoors but protected by enclosure, a compromise between exposure and privacy. Safety was one of the chief advantages of these semi-public shelters. Unlike isolated roadside sleeping, staying within a synagogue complex or enclosed courtyard reduced the risk of surprise encounters. Visibility was better, boundaries were clearer, community presence acted as deterrent. Even the psychological comfort of walls and structure made rest easier after uncertain travel. Group sleeping arrangements were the norm in these settings. Individual rooms were rarely available for travelers. Instead, companions settled together along walls or in corners, using cloaks and mats just as they would outdoors. Personal space remained minimal, but shared presence increased security and warmth. Quiet conversation or prayer might continue briefly before sleep. These public shelters were especially practical on nights before or after teaching gatherings. A visiting teacher might arrive, speak in the synagogue, remain afterward answering questions, and stay the night within the same complex. This reduced night travel risk and allowed early continuation the next morning. It also created extended access for those seeking counsel or healing. Lighting inside such spaces was limited, small oil lamps at best, so nighttime activity remained minimal. Once darkness settled fully, stillness followed. Stone floors released stored daytime heat slowly, sometimes making interiors more comfortable than open ground during cool nights. Resting in synagogues, porches, and courtyards reflects an important reality of Jesus' traveling life. His mission unfolded within community infrastructure. These were not remote hideouts, but shared civic religious spaces. Sleeping there placed him close to the people he served, not separated from them. These shelters were simple, temporary, and communal. Yet for a traveling teacher with no fixed residence, they formed an essential part of the night landscape, structured spaces where the journey could pause, if only for a few hours, before the road called again at dawn.
In the varied terrain of Galilee and the bordering regions toward Judea, natural shelters were part of the traveler's survival landscape. Caves, rock overhangs, and shallow stone recesses dotted hillsides and desert edges. Formed by erosion and time, these spaces offered something precious to anyone caught between destinations at night: partial protection without needing a built structure. For a traveling teacher and his companions, such places could become temporary refuge.
Galilee's limestone geology naturally produces cavities and grotto-like formations. Some were large enough to stand in, others were little more than recessed walls that blocked wind from one direction. Shepherds used them. Farmers stored tools in them. Travelers recognized them as fallback shelter when no village lodging was available before dark. The primary advantage of a cave or rock overhang was environmental protection. Wind exposure drops body temperature quickly at night, especially after a day of sweating under the sun. Even a partial stone barrier significantly reduced heat loss. Rock also radiates stored warmth after sunset, sometimes making these spaces slightly more temperate than open ground during the first hours of night. Temperature stability mattered even more near desert edge zones and higher elevations, where day-night swings were extreme. In such areas, sleeping fully exposed could be harsh. A shallow cave mouth could block cold downdrafts and drifting dust. During rare rain, it prevented soaking, a serious risk when clothing and blankets were limited. Location influenced suitability. A good natural shelter sat above runoff lines, away from dry stream beds that could flood suddenly. It showed no signs of animal den use, tracks, droppings, strong odor. Experienced travelers read these signals carefully. Entering the wrong cave could be dangerous. Caution preceded comfort. Inside, conditions were basic at best. Floors were uneven, moisture sometimes collected. Insects and small creatures were common. There were no furnishings, no prepared surfaces. Cloaks and mats had to compensate. Sleeping positions adapted to available space. Curled, seated against rock, or partially reclined. Comfort was secondary to cover. Yet these shelters offered something beyond physical protection: isolation. Removed from village noise and road traffic, caves and rock ledges created natural quiet zones. Sound dampened, light faded early. Such settings naturally lent themselves to reflection and prayer. The gospel accounts often mention Jesus withdrawing to lonely or solitary places to pray. While not every instance implies a cave, the landscape made such retreats entirely plausible. Isolation, however, carried its own tension. Security increased against weather, but sometimes decreased against human threat if the site was too remote. A hidden shelter protects, but also conceals. Travelers balanced visibility and cover, preferring locations not directly on main paths, yet not impossibly far from them. Fire use inside caves required care. Smoke accumulation could choke a space quickly. Small entrance fires or ember beds just outside were safer, providing warmth without suffocation risk. Light from such fires flickered across stone walls, creating moving shadows, a stark contrast to the open star nights of field sleeping. Choosing a cave meant accepting discomfort in exchange for stability. Hard ground, tight space, stale air, but less wind, less exposure, more control. It was a practical decision, not a romantic one. For Jesus and his companions, natural shelters would have represented one more adaptive layer in a life without fixed lodging. When hospitality was unavailable and open ground too exposed, the earth itself, carved by time, became the night's shelter. Not comfortable, not permanent, but sufficient for rest, prayer, and rising again to continue the journey.
Travel in the first century Levant was not only physically demanding, it could also be dangerous. Roads were uneven, lighting was non-existent, and law enforcement outside major routes was limited. For those journeying across Galilee and neighboring regions, night brought not only darkness and cold, but uncertainty. Sleep, when it came, was often light and alert rather than deep and secure. Banditry was a known risk along certain roads and border areas.
Trade routes and connecting paths between towns attracted thieves who targeted travelers carrying goods, coins, or animals. Stories and warnings about roadside attacks circulated widely enough to shape behavior. People avoided unnecessary night travel whenever possible. When delay was unavoidable, they chose resting places carefully. Group travel significantly increased safety. Jesus rarely moved entirely alone during his ministry journeys. The presence of disciples and followers created both companionship and deterrence. A small group was less vulnerable than an individual sleeper. Shared presence also meant shared awareness, more ears to catch approaching footsteps, more eyes to notice distant movement. Nights in uncertain areas often involved rotating watchfulness. While not a formal military guard system, practical vigilance existed. One or two individuals might remain partially awake while others slept, then rest later in turn. This pattern was common among shepherds and caravan travelers and likely influenced group behavior on extended journeys. Even without structured shifts, lighter sleepers naturally served as early warning. Sleeping posture itself adapted to risk. Travelers often kept cloaks, belts, and sandals within immediate reach. Important items were not unpacked fully. Quick readiness mattered. Rising and moving rapidly could be necessary if threat appeared. Deep, undisturbed sleep was a luxury not always available. Regional tensions added another layer of caution. The relationship between Jewish and Samaritan communities was historically strained. Travel routes that crossed or bordered Samaritan territories could be socially and physically unpredictable. Some travelers chose longer alternate paths to avoid confrontation. When passage through tense regions occurred, heightened alertness followed, including at night stops. Darkness amplified vulnerability. Without artificial lighting, visibility dropped to near zero away from settlements. Moon phase mattered. On moonless nights, movement beyond a few steps became hazardous. Sounds traveled farther and felt more threatening. Animal calls, shifting stones, wind through brush, each noise requiring interpretation. Was it harmless or human? Interrupted sleep was common under such conditions. A distant shout, barking dogs from a far-off village, or sudden weather change could wake a resting group. Once awakened, returning to sleep might take time. Fatigue accumulated across days of travel, yet caution prevented full surrender to exhaustion. Weather could also force abrupt nighttime movement. Sudden windstorms near the lake or cold fronts in elevated areas made certain resting spots unsafe. Travelers sometimes relocated in the dark to find better cover. These disruptions fragmented rest into segments rather than a continuous night's sleep. Despite these risks, fear did not define every night, but vigilance often shaped it. Awareness was part of survival. Stillness did not always mean safety. Quiet did not always mean peace. Under such realities, rest required trust in companions, in chosen location, and in God's protection. This context gives deeper meaning to moments in the gospel accounts where Jesus speaks about watchfulness, readiness, and staying awake. Such language emerged from lived experience, not abstraction. Night travel culture understood alertness as wisdom, not anxiety. For a traveling teacher moving through varied territories, nights were not uniformly calm. Some were peaceful beneath stars or roofs of welcome. Others were edged with caution. Sleep came, but often lightly, ready to yield at the first sign of danger, movement, or the call to continue the journey before dawn. Not all of Jesus' nights were spent on land. Some unfolded on the waters of the Sea of Galilee, a lake both life-giving and unpredictable. Fishing boats were a normal part of daily economic life in the region, and several of Jesus' closest disciples were fishermen by trade. When travel required crossing the lake, or when teaching extended late into the day near the shore, the boat itself could become a temporary resting place. First-century Galilean fishing boats were sturdy but modest. Built of wood, roughly 7 to 8 meters long, they were designed for nets and small crews, not passenger comfort. There were no cabins, no enclosed sleeping quarters, no padded surfaces. The interior consisted mainly of open working space with low seating ledges and storage areas for gear. Sleeping in such a vessel meant resting directly on planks, bundled rope, or folded cloaks. Night conditions on the lake could change quickly. The Sea of Galilee sits in a basin surrounded by hills. Cool air rushing down slopes can collide with warm air over the water, producing sudden violent storms. Even experienced fishermen respected these weather shifts. Waves could rise fast, wind could reverse direction. What began as a calm crossing could become dangerous within minutes. One well-known gospel scene captures this reality vividly. Jesus asleep in a boat during a storm, while his companions struggle in fear. From a historical perspective, this moment reflects genuine physical exhaustion. After long days of walking, teaching, healing, and constant social demand, deep sleep could overtake a person even in unstable conditions. Fatigue sometimes outweighs discomfort and noise. Sleeping on a boat required adaptation. Movement never fully stopped, gentle rocking in calm water, sharp jolts in rough weather. Sound was continuous, waves against the hull, rigging strain, wind gusts, shouted instructions. Light sleepers would wake often. Only someone severely tired could remain asleep through heavy disturbance. Boats did offer a few advantages compared to open ground. There were no roadside bandits in mid-lake. Insect levels were often lower away from shore. Group proximity increased, everyone within arm's reach. Yet exposure remained high. Spray, cold air, and sudden rain could soak clothing and blankets quickly. There's also a powerful symbolic contrast in these boat sleep accounts. Contrast outside, rest within. While wind and waves raged, Jesus' sleep represented inner stillness amid external turmoil. Whether read devotionally or historically, the image endures. A teacher so spent from service and so anchored in trust that rest comes even when the environment is unstable. On land or water, the pattern remains consistent. His sleep was real, human, and often interrupted, shaped not by comfort but by mission, movement, and the demands of the journey.
Not every night in Jesus' ministry was spent sleeping. The gospel accounts repeatedly describe him withdrawing to lonely places, hillsides, wilderness edges, mountain slopes, specifically to pray. These moments reveal another dimension of his nighttime rhythm, deliberate solitude chosen over rest. In a life already marked by physical fatigue, he sometimes surrendered sleep itself to seek silence and communion with the Father. These withdrawals often followed days of intense public demand, teaching crowds, healing the sick, responding to challenges, guiding disciples. All of this required emotional as well as physical energy. Solitude was not escape, but renewal. Night provided the only uninterrupted window. When villages slept and questions paused, prayer could deepen without distraction. Such prayer nights were likely not brief. The texts imply extended vigils, hours rather than minutes. Climbing to a quiet elevation after sunset, remaining through darkness, and returning at dawn suggests sustained wakefulness. This pattern aligns with known Jewish devotional practices in which night prayer signified urgency, dependence, and surrender. Choosing prayer over sleep carries a cost. Fatigue accumulates.
Cognitive sharpness dulls, emotional sensitivity heightens. Yet these solitary nights seem to have been intentional turning points, before major decisions, after intense ministry periods, or ahead of coming trials. Rest for the body was deferred to strengthen resolve of spirit. The emotional burden Jesus carried is easy to underestimate when reading short passages. Constant crowds meant constant need. Suffering people pressed close. Conflict with religious authorities increased over time. Misunderstanding followed even among his own disciples. Solitary night prayer created space to process grief, compassion, frustration, and purpose without audience. The most extreme example appears in Gethsemane. There, night, fatigue, prayer, and inner struggle converge. After a long day and evening meal, Jesus goes out to pray while his closest companions repeatedly fall asleep from exhaustion. The contrast is striking. Human bodies reaching their limit beside a soul engaged in profound spiritual anguish. The scene underscores both realities, his full humanity and his unwavering intention. Descriptions of that night include distress, sorrow, and intense focus. Prayer becomes effortful, not serene. Time stretches, support feels distant. This is not peaceful meditation, but wrestling resolve. Sleep is not merely postponed, it is impossible under the weight of what he faces. Solitary night prayer also meant physical vulnerability. Leaving group shelter increased exposure to cold, terrain hazards, and potential threat. Yet solitude was chosen anyway. The need for communion outweighed the need for comfort. These patterns reveal that Jesus' nights were not defined only by where he slept, but also by when he did not. Rest alternated with vigil. Stillness alternated with struggle. Silence alternated with supplication. Seen through a human lens, this rhythm is recognizable. When responsibility grows heavy, sleep often becomes lighter, shorter, or delayed. Important decisions are rarely made in comfort alone. They are forged in quiet hours when distractions fall away. In these solitary nights, whether on hills above Galilee or among olive trees near Jerusalem, fatigue and prayer met, not as opposites, but as companions. The body tired, the spirit reached upward, and in that tension, strength for the next day's journey was formed.
When we step back and gather all these scenes, open fields, borrowed rooms, synagogue floors, boat decks, rocky shelters, prayerful hillsides, a pattern emerges. The way Jesus rested was not accidental. It was consistent with the life he chose to live and the message he chose to bring. His sleeping conditions were not built on comfort, ownership, or control, but on simplicity, movement, and trust. He did not build a secure base of operations. He did not accumulate property to guarantee ease. During his ministry years, rest was received, not secured. Shelter was often borrowed. Space was shared. Nights were shaped by availability rather than preference. This reveals a radical detachment from material certainty, not as rejection of the physical world, but as freedom from depending on it. His pattern of rest shows resilience. Sleep came where it could, outdoors, indoors, in crowds, in storms, after long walks, between teachings, after emotional strain. Modern rest is often engineered, controlled temperature, controlled sound, controlled surfaces. His rest was adaptive. He did not wait for perfect conditions. He accepted sufficient ones. That resilience is not merely physical, it is deeply spiritual. There is also a repeated thread of dependence on others. Many of his nights were made possible by hospitality, by unnamed families, ordinary households, shared community spaces. Receiving shelter requires humility. It places the receiver in a vulnerable position. The one who teaches and heals also knocks, enters,
accepts water, shares food, and lies down under another person's roof. This mutuality is part of the story. Strength and need coexist. His rest also highlights true human vulnerability. He grew tired enough to sleep through storms. He withdrew because the crowds exhausted him. He lost sleep in prayer under emotional weight. These are not symbolic details, they are human ones. They remind us that fatigue is not failure. Weariness is not weakness. Even a life filled with purpose still requires pause. And yet, across these varied resting places, another constant appears: trust. Trust in provision, trust in timing, trust in protection beyond visible security. Whether under open sky or uncertain roof, rest was an act of surrender, a willingness to release control for a few hours and receive renewal. For viewers reflecting today, this invites a gentle question. What do our own habits of rest reveal about what we rely on most? Comfort is not wrong. Safety is not wrong. But the contrast is clarifying. His rest was simple, mobile, relational, and prayer-shaped. It was integrated into mission, not separated from it. There is also quiet encouragement here. Meaningful work and deep compassion will sometimes leave us tired. Service drains energy. Caring costs sleep. Important callings rarely come with perfect conditions. Yet renewal is still possible in borrowed spaces, imperfect settings, interrupted nights. His way of rest tells us that peace is not produced only by environment. It is rooted in alignment, knowing why you walk, whom you serve, and where you place your trust. So when we picture his journey through Galilee, the roads, the villages, the waters, the hills, we should also picture the nights, the cloak folded beneath his head, the shared room growing quiet, the boat rocking under wind, the solitary hillside under stars. Not luxury, not permanence, but enough. And sometimes enough is where true rest begins.